Welcome to the Ask JP podcast, the podcast where we sort through hours of noise to get to the heart of the issues you care about. We have a very important election this fall. I'm not talking about the presidential election, I'm not talking about the congressional or judicial races. We've already covered those. I'm talking about everyone's favorite thing, constitutional amendments. You know, those really dry pieces of disparate sentences that don't mean much? Well, this election, they do mean a lot. Today, we're going to talk about Constitutional Amendment 1. And with me as my guest, we have Michelle Erenberg. Michelle has worked as a policy advocate, community organizer, and coalition coordinator for more than a decade. Since 2009, she has volunteered as a board member with the National Council of Jewish Women Greater New Orleans section and served as NCJW's Louisiana policy advocate and nationally appointed position, as well as the Vice President of Public Affairs and Education. In these roles, she's represented NCJW with a variety of coalitions in Louisiana advocating for reproductive rights, economic justice, and civil rights. In 2016, she co-founded Lift Louisiana to educate, advocate, and litigate in defense of reproductive rights. Michelle, before we get started, can you kind of give everyone kind of a brief overview of what Lyft is? Because I'm sure people have seen it on Twitter and they've seen it on Instagram, but it's a really important organization. I want to make sure everyone knows what you do.
Sure. And thank you so much, JP, for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited. It's good to see you. So Lift Louisiana is a nonprofit reproductive rights advocacy organization. And we educate, we advocate, and we litigate. We focus on policies that will actually improve the health and well-being of Louisiana's women, children, and families. And so included in that, we work on reproductive rights, we work on economic justice issues, we partner with folks on criminal justice insofar that that's having an impact on people's family. So we really take an intersectional approach to our work.
Well, that's fantastic. So I'm going to read the constitutional amendment we're talking about, Constitutional Amendment 1 on your ballot. So once you get through everything else, like the 6 pages of candidates, there's these 5 amendments on the bottom, which I'm going to imagine, Michelle, the fall off on voting on that's going to be like 50%, but hopefully people will listen to this podcast and not be in that 50% doesn't cast that crucial vote. But the amendment reads, it's an amendment to section 20.1 of the Constitution, and it adds the lines to protect human life. Nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to secure or protect a right to abortion or require the funding of abortion. Michelle, can you explain Amendment 1, kind of obviously that one sentence? And let me just give a little bit of background before we get into that. Ballot language is not done by a constitutional scholar. Basically, whomever controls the legislature, when a constitutional amendment is passed, these things have that one sense, but a significant amount of dialogue in the amendment as well, and committee notes and a plethora of information. It's all kicked out, and basically the legislature and people who control the legislature determine what the ballot language says. So what you're reading on that ballot is kind of not a clear cut, this is what you're voting on. It's this is what the majority that passed it wants you to think of. This is what the majority who passed this instance wants you to believe this amendment does. So why don't you kind of give us an overview of what does this amendment really do? What is the purpose of it?
Well, you're right. It's meant to be confusing to people, but the real purpose of this amendment is to strip people from their constitutional right to have an abortion, and also to ensure that there is never any public funding for abortion in Louisiana. And that's important to know because Louisiana already has laws on the books that restrict public funding for abortion. So the constitutional amendment in that respect is really quite unnecessary. But I think it's really important for people to understand that the aim of this is to one, bolster the anti-abortion movement's efforts to restrict access and outright ban access to abortion in Louisiana, but also to prevent advocates for expanded access to abortion from ever being able to enact laws in Louisiana, because we would have in our Constitution that there is no right to abortion. So it would make any effort to expand access or to provide access much more difficult.
And more importantly, part of what people don't grasp is that when you have the Roe v. Wade argument, the Roe v. Wade argument is that there's a constitutional federal right to have an abortion, which applies to all states. So it says, my body, I choose. Supreme Court says it. States can't restrict it. I use this analogy. I used to use it when I was in the legislature frequently, that Louisiana has passed probably a dozen, 2 dozen laws outlawing abortion every which way they can think of. And all those laws are kind of like the Huns outside of Rome, and Roe v. Wade is kind of like the gate, the wall around Rome. And the goal is, should Roe v. Wade become invalid before Congress can do anything, before the president can do anything, before there can be any fix, all of these different laws kind of collapse on the state and outlaw every single possible type of abortion you could possibly do. And basically, if Roe v. Wade were to topple, Louisiana would have so many layered ways of banning abortion. Even if Congress stepped in and passed an act, you would be in litigation for decades undoing all the laws that have been put in place. And this is kind of another one of them. I know that in my analysis, this was kind of a knee-jerk reaction to a ruling from the Kansas State Supreme Court, where they came out and said that basically you can't pick out which rights and which human rights that you allow and fund and don't fund. In that sense, women had rights in the Kansas State Constitution. You couldn't just say, except for this one. And so a lot of states have said, no, 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 no. And Louisiana is now one of them. We give you rights, but not this one. We're going to take this one out. We're going to make sure everyone agrees, women, you do not have this particular right. And I mean, it's really egregious.
Yeah,
Wouldn't you agree?
yeah, I totally agree. And, I think, but most voters really understand that a constitution is a document that is supposed to be affirming people's rights, not to be used to literally take away certain rights from certain segments of society. So, in one sense, this could be kind of a slippery slope. If we're now looking at the Constitution as a means of taking rights away from people. And then the other thing that I just want to point out, you're right. Louisiana has so many abortion restrictions on the books, 89 actually that have been passed or enacted, many more passed, but that are actually enacted since Roe was decided in 1973. And so there are already so many barriers in the pathway of people seeking abortion in Louisiana. We only have 3 clinics in the entire state, which makes access really difficult for people who don't live near one of those cities. Like, for example, if you live in Lake Charles, you're going to drive 130 miles one way just to reach the nearest abortion clinic. So there is this scheme that has been constructed, over the decades to restrict access to the extent allowable by the federal government and within the bounds of Supreme Court precedent. Louisiana has really pushed the boundaries on that. And what they're trying to do with this constitutional amendment is really, basically put up one final barrier in the pathway of people by making it really difficult to ever challenge an abortion restriction at the state level. And that's really important right now as we're facing the very real possibility that abortion access may not be protected at the federal level either, with this what looks to be wild swing to the right on the Supreme Court. So this constitutional amendment is really, really, really important for us to defeat at this moment, because we can't go backwards. Louisiana people that can or have become pregnant who want to access an abortion or who may need to access an abortion need to have that right.
Well, and I mean, when you look at on a real basic level, the way this amendment is written, if Roe v. Wade is overturned as far as the federal level. In Congress, the Affordable Care Act allows women through their insurance to have access to these resources. The way this amendment is written is that the state could say, no, even though it's not state of Louisiana money, we're banning any public money. So whatever flow through you have, if it's public dollars, it's not your private money out your pocket. It's not your private insurer, theoretically. Now, I'm disregarding the other 18,000 laws banning abortion, but this really paints with a very broad stroke, limiting resources for women, whether it's from the state or federal level, to make reproductive choices, generally speaking. I've always made the argument, and I know you've made it as well, that you really shouldn't do things like this in constitutions, because
Right.
a lot of, when you look at the language, you look at how it's interpreted, it's all very subjective. I know that I have had throwdown fights with Right to Life over Amendment 1061, the one that deals with abortion prohibitions in general. And they talk about how, well, we protect the morning after pill, we protect birth control. And it's like, if you read them, you're like, do you? Because parts of the amendment contradict each other and it's all subjective. So when you put stuff in there, you're basically leaving it up to a judge, who's typically an old white guy, to decide whether or not the Constitution bars things like the morning after pill, bars things like birth control, because it's all, they're too nervous to spell out. And you've seen it, you and I have had this argument with people before. They have outlawed chemical abortions throughout statute. And they
Mhm.
repeatedly tell people, we're talking about other types of chemical abortions, not the morning after pill and not these other things that people are already doing. But it's all subjective, because if a judge goes, nope, chemical abortions, that pill you take, that's a chemical abortion, that could have tremendous effects for people who think that it's this vote for this amendment and this type of behavior is innocuous. They think, oh, well, if I vote for this, nothing changes. And it's like, no, nothing's changed, because Roe v. Wade is keeping the Huns out. If Roe v. Wade falls, everything changes overnight.
That's right. And I think that it is really important to point out that the people who want to restrict abortion access, they consider many forms of birth control, and especially the morning after pill, to be quote unquote abortifacients, even though they are not. And the FDA does not consider them to be abortifacients. But if the Louisiana legislature were to decide that they were abortifacients, that they were, in a sense, acting in the same way as medication abortion, then this constitutional amendment could very well be used to restrict access to forms of birth control, including emergency contraception. So yeah, I think it doesn't stop with abortion. They the goal really is to control what people can and can't do with their own bodies, to control, when, whether, and how people become parents. And maybe we're going to talk about this, but I'll just go ahead and throw it out there. Um, uh, there was a big conversation when this amendment was being discussed in 2019 about why it didn't include exceptions for people who may have become pregnant because of a rape or because of incest, or why there was an exception for the health or life of the mother. And there were many efforts to add those exceptions into this amendment, at least into the statute and the description, to make it clear that those exceptions would be protected. And they were rejected at every single step of the way. You were there, you
I
heard
was
the
there.
testimony, you heard the arguments against
I've
it.
I've voted every time for the exceptions. The thing is, but people don't understand, because you're reading this one sentence on your ballot. It has so many tremendous repercussions. I mean, if it's not in the amendment, it doesn't exist.
That's
And
right.
the statutory accompaniment, when you deal with constitutional amendments, they're typically very short, and you rely upon statute to help you interpret it. And the danger of all these amendments and this Constitution is that if you don't include stuff like exceptions for life of the mother, for rape or incest in the constitutional amendment, that means they're only statutory protections, which
And we
means that
don't
any get
have, yeah, we
right.
don't have the statutory protections in those circumstances. The trigger law, as we call it, the one that would take effect to ban abortions if Roe v. Wade were ever overturned, that law does not include exceptions for rape or incest. And there is a very limited exception
For life of
for
the
the
life of
life
the
of the
mother.
mother. It's extraordinarily limited. And so when I read, Senator Katrina Jackson's op-ed that she had published in the Advocate this week, where she's saying, oh, the legislature could come back and add those exceptions in. They're not going to, and it's very clear that they have no intention of doing
Well,
that, because they could have done it,
right. I
you
mean,
know.
it's a very disingenuous argument because she doesn't list in there. We try to get those exceptions put in, and the legislature voted it down. The legislature's already established they don't believe in rape and incest exceptions. They don't believe in life of the mother exceptions. In fact, just to kind of piggyback on that, the number one group of people that I've spoken to that are adamantly opposed to this amendment are OBGYNs.
Mm.
OBGYNs think this is horrific. And they think it's horrific because all the statutes we have criminalize abortion in 18 different ways. I mean, you're talking about, we have, like you said, 89 bills that ban abortion every which way you can ban it and criminalize it. If you've got an OB who's got a woman who has a miscarriage, has had a miscarriage, and has a dead fetus inside of her, they have to worry, does that dead fetus immediately threaten her health? Will I be able to, when I'm under criminal investigation, say that that fetus was definitely dead when I removed it? You're going to have people who are doctors who have to make medical decisions, second guessing themselves because of the threat of prosecution. And these OBs are telling me, well, I mean, I don't know what to do because I don't want a woman who's miscarried to carry a dead baby around inside of her, but I also don't want to lose my license and be unable to provide for my family or practice medicine that I love.
Or
So
go
I'm
to
literally
jail.
caught, right, go to jail. I'm caught in the cross section of, I have an ethical obligation and oath to help this person, but the state has criminalized me being able as a doctor to make it as her. It harkens back to, I have one bill that keeps me up at night. It keeps me up at night. Out of all those abortion bills, there's one bill that keeps me up at night. And it's Austin Badoff's bill from 2014, the coma bill,
Oh yeah, the incubator bill.
the
Yes.
incubator bill. And it's really a summary of kind of where the Louisiana is on this argument. A bill was passed. It was HB 1274 in 2014 by then Representative Badoff. And it says that there was that horrific case in Texas, right? In
I think so.
Texas, where a woman had a car accident and died. She was pregnant. She was dead, brain dead, on life support. And the Texas law said that because she was pregnant, despite the fact her family wanted to take her off life support and let her die, they had to keep her on life support so they could bring the baby to term. Now, the medical community in Texas lost their minds because they were like, listen, you don't understand. If someone's dead and they're on life support, they're not able to provide the proper status to gestate a baby to term. You're talking about a baby that would be born, if at all, which has never happened, with horrific genetic defects, would probably die upon birth, but you're going to force a family to watch their dead, essentially dead loved one incubate a baby because of life. And after all the court stepped in and said, "Oh hell no," Louisiana after that said, "No, no, no, we're gonna make sure that's the case in Louisiana." And I remember we were arguing that bill, Michelle, and we're trying to tell people, when it's amazing to me how when it comes to gun rights or any other right, it's government, keep your damn hands off my guns. Government, keep my damn hands off my house, off my taxes. Government, if my wife is 2 weeks pregnant and in a coma, you're going to take away all my rights as a husband, all my rights as a brother, sister, mother, father. Screw you. She's got to be incubated. And by the way, we couldn't even get language in saying the state would pay for it. So by
Right,
the way, we're going to
right,
bankrupt you while your dead relative brings a baby to term, which science has said will never live, will never make it to term. And I remember that when I think about this amendment, because to your point, the legislature has been crystal clear. They don't give a crap. They don't. They don't give a crap. They care more about checking this box than actually protecting women or babies. That's just generally, I mean, that's generally been the position for years.
yeah. I mean, I think that that's absolutely true. As soon as a person becomes pregnant, they no longer have any rights, and all of the rights, accrue to, you know, the the clump of cells, that may become a fetus, that may eventually become a living baby in their body. And we know that they don't actually care about the potential life, growing inside that pregnant person, because they do nothing to support, to
You are
support
a
these
1000%
mothers.
correct.
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredibly hypocritical and cynical and cruel. It's honestly cruel.
Well, to that point, I mean, you see this argument. I mean, I don't think they've made the argument recently, but it's while we pass all these bills that deal with pro-life issues, we don't deal with health care for women that are pregnant. We have the highest mortality rate for pregnant women in the country. So we don't provide any health care for you while you're pregnant. Good luck. You can't abort a baby, but good luck taking care of yourself to get the baby born. We don't provide any resources or services to women after they've had a baby. We provide no resources or services to those children through pre-K. We might give them adequate kindergarten. Good luck when you go to elementary school. And by the way, families, if you have no control over your body, if your husband or boyfriend decides to impregnate you and you have a bunch of babies, oh, by the way, we also don't have comprehensive sex ed, which, I mean, I was going to get to that in another part of this, but like people say, well, they should just not have babies. And it's like, we can't teach them how babies are made. I mean, let's go right into that, Michelle, because I know it's a big issue for Lyft. We've been talking about it for years. We literally in the legislature have prohibited schools from teaching sex ed. Talk about that.
Yes. So for years, and quite honestly, hats off to former Representative Pat Smith, who just took this issue on and fought it over and over and over again. And just the amount of patience that she had with her colleagues year after year, sitting in front of the Education Committee, explaining to them that young people need information about sexual reproductive health in order to make good decisions, for their bodies, for their relationships. It's not even just about, you know, them keeping themselves safe from an unwanted pregnancy or from a sexually transmitted infection. It's also about, helping young people really understand what's appropriate and not appropriate in terms of their relationships, which, makes a meaningful difference later on in their life when we look at rates of sexual assault and things like that. So I think that it's been very, very, very frustrating. And we hear again, it's mostly the same people that are anti-abortion, who are arguing and fighting and trying to, make sure that we absolutely can't get any comprehensive age appropriate sex education in the state of Louisiana. They're up there lying, essentially lying. Well, we shouldn't teach kids about, condoms and birth control because they're not even that effective in, preventing pregnancy. Well, that is a lie. And, unfortunately, some of the legislators don't know any better, so, they take them on their word. And it is, you know, it's just incredibly frustrating because we know how high the rates of pregnancy are among young people under 18. We know how high the rates of sexually transmitted infections are. And a lot of the legislators really just think if you say anything to kids about sex, then they're all of a sudden going to start having sex. When if you know, don't say anything to them or just tell them not to have sex, then that's the best protection. Well, that's clearly not working. We
Well,
can see it in the rates.
but to your point, look at the socioeconomic background of people who tend to have multiple pregnancies and lack of access to sex education. If you go to any private school in the state of Louisiana, they have comprehensive sex education.
Mhm.
Hell, you can go to Catholic schools and they have comprehensive sex education. But the same people will go into a legislative committee hearing and say, we do not want comprehensive sex education in public schools. That is where the fight is, because the reality is that when we're legislating policy as far as things like sex ed, we're talking about public schools, because private schools can do whatever the hell they want. And it's amazing because if you look at who has the information, who doesn't get pregnant, who makes better choices with their body, it's the people with access to that superior esque private education that's unfettered by legislative interference. In public education, where the legislature has some insight, we say, no, you can't talk about how A plus B equals baby. But at the same time, like I said, we don't provide any resources to people in school. We don't provide any access to birth control. I mean, I can't tell you how many frustrated conversations I've had with friends of mine who are well educated, moderate Republicans who go, well, I mean, they could just, they know how babies are made. I'm like, no, but they don't. Because if you don't tell them how babies are made, you don't learn through osmosis. You don't, I mean, the only other way, if the only other way kids can learn sex ed, if not in school with teachers who are caring with scientific information, is the internet and television. Do you really want
Right.
kids to learn sex ed through the internet and television?
That's right. And that's what's happening. That's absolutely what's happening. And we hear from the legislators that parents are the ones that should be teaching their kids this information. Well, Louisiana Public Health Institute did a survey 2 years ago of parents, a really wide, comprehensive survey of parents. And they found overwhelmingly that parents, A, think their kids are learning more about sex education in the schools than they actually are. And B, they think their kids should be learning that information. And C, they don't feel comfortable talking to their kids about it. They don't feel they have the information because they, having grown up in Louisiana, are the second or third generation of parents that had no access to sex education themselves.
Right. Um, let's try and talk about some positive things. So,
Great.
um, we've had some movement on a couple of issues. Obviously, Representative Freeman did some tremendous work with the local pink tax and giving local government the ability to provide exemptions. I know she's working on during possibly next fiscal session dealing with the state portion. That was a win for women in the state of Louisiana. I mean, the fact that we were taxing, state still continues to tax uh, tampons and feminine hygiene products is problematic. I mean, it's problematic on a multiple point of levels, but what do you think are some positive things that have happened over the last couple of years that have kind of moved the ball forward for women in the state of Louisiana?
I think that there has been a robust movement around equal pay. And although we haven't gotten exactly where we want to be with, you know, making sure that women are paid equally in the state, we have a good foundation and a good framework. And we definitely have a large, like really robust coalition of organizations and that are working on that issue and allies in the legislature to work with. So that I think is, has been huge. We still have a lot of work to do, but I don't want to undercount the work that's been done already. I also think that um, the there it seems like people really are starting to understand the maternal mortality crisis in Louisiana in a way that we haven't seen discussions about that in past years. And so I know that Representative Matt Willard introduced some legislation that ended up getting tabled because of COVID, but intends to bring some legislation back that would provide more access to doulas and to midwives by having them covered in the Medicaid program. 64% of all births in Louisiana are covered by Medicaid. So, having access to that pregnancy support for people who are in the Medicaid program could make a huge difference in pregnancy outcomes and birth outcomes. And you led a lot of the effort with now Councilwoman Helena Moreno to expand protections for people who are survivors of domestic violence. So it's not all bad news. It certainly isn't. And there's some really good foundations for us to build on in the coming years. But we still, we just really have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge always is that in the legislature, you have to pretty much dust yourself off at every opportunity after every defeat and go right back into the fight. And what I've always loved about Lift and law too, legislative agenda for women, is that you guys always have the ability that after suffering a major setback in committee A, you're able to walk over to committee B and start working on a different issue. Because I mean, there's just so many issues facing women in the state of Louisiana. I mean, we've done so much. I know in particular, I think what Helena did in regards to restricting firearms to domestic abusers so they can't kill the spouses they're threatening to kill. It seems like common sense, but that was a multi-year battle we all had to fight with the NRA to say, we have the data that shows if an abusive spouse has a firearm and the other spouse leaves or threatens to leave, they kill them. And it took us years to get that work done, but organizations like yours help put in the work with United Way Southeast Louisiana, with Charmaine Cassiope and Kim Sport. I mean, it's like people sometimes don't get, and when you talk about issues like we're talking about Amendment 1, that you have to educate legislators. Legislators really have no idea how their votes have practical application for women in their district. I mean, the movement we saw last cycle, and the last cycle I was in, started in 2016, ended in 2020, on equal pay, for example, was a direct correlation between the grassroots work that you guys did to educate voters on equal pay, because legislators and candidates poll issues. And there were several Republicans that told me, I polled equal pay in my district. It's an issue. People care about this. So because they care about it, now I have to care about it. So the off-season work that y'all do, educating women, educating voters, explaining to people who are living in poverty, you're living in poverty, but you know that your primary breadwinner is making 40% of what you should make. If you just made equal pay, you'd be out of poverty. I mean, that work is invaluable.
It does take endurance and it does take persistence. And one of the stories that I like to tell, because we do actually do a lot of training for advocates, and it can be frustrating. People go in really gung ho and it doesn't get done that first year, and it may not get done that second year. But one of the stories that I really like to tell is we started having conversations about equal pay with Representative Julie Stokes years ago. And she was very, very, very much against it. And it was important for us to talk to her because she was on the Labor Committee in the House. And so her vote was, critical to whether or not we were even going to get equal pay out of that committee. And when we first started talking to her and she said, I'm not for this, we could have just given up on her and walked away, but we didn't. We kept coming back to her. We kept introducing her to her own constituents that cared about this issue. And eventually she moved. Eventually she saw enough evidence, she listened to enough of her constituents, and she moved and started to actually support, our efforts to expand equal pay in the state. So the arc of justice, the arc, bends towards justice, but it does take a long time to get there, and it is an endurance fight. And these past couple of years have been so difficult. People have been out in the streets protesting. They've been doing so much, and they're exhausted, and burnout is real, when you're doing advocacy work. But that's why groups like us exist. We're around to try to keep you motivated to mix the hardcore hard stuff advocacy with some fun events that we're doing to keep you involved, and to make sure that you have the information to have conversations in your own community, among your own family members, and with your own legislators.
Well, I always tell people, and I've told a lot of the younger legislators, the new ones that have come in, not just younger, the new ones. I say, listen, don't get frustrated, because in Louisiana, literally progress is glacial. Like, it's like watching an iceberg. You're not going to see, especially in this state, as conservative as it is, that you won't see like the fruit of your labor. Like, Blake Miguez voted to take away guns in the domestic violence bill. Think about that. This is a guy who's a top shot, you know, History Channel gun guy, who firmly believes vehemently in the right to bear arms. It took years for us to build relationships to convince him and show him the data showing this is not about taking away your guns. It's about taking away the guns from people in this limited instance where bad outcomes happen. And it's not just bad for the people who are dying, it's bad for the gun agenda, because it makes people hate guns even more than they already do. And you have to take a lot of time, and it's a lot of work to build those relationships, to educate people, to move them to your issue. And I think the challenge that we are going to face in the next 2 or 3 years is that there's so much momentum for significant change in all walks of life in Louisiana, that my concern is that people see such immediate change in New Orleans and they go, we're going to go to Baton Rouge and change everything. And it's like, you might, but it's not going to happen in 1 year. It's not going to happen in 2 years. I mean, hell, it's 4 years of an election cycle. It might not happen in 4 years. Like, you have to try and keep people motivated to say, listen, as long as the ball's moving forward, it'll get there. It
Yeah.
just may not get there as fast as you like. And I mean, it's
We're
a
not
hard
going to
pill to
do it.
swallow.
We're not going to do it with New Orleans delegation alone. And that's
Right.
why the work that we're doing on this amendment campaign is so critical, because, we're really building a statewide movement, and, we're mobilizing them obviously to defeat this amendment, but that movement's going to be there, and, we'll be working to mobilize them during the legislative session, and to keep them involved in this fight. So, it is, it's difficult, and people, they want to see quick change. They want to see the silver bullet solution. And, we get criticized sometimes at Lift Louisiana for being too conservative, not being radical enough. And accepting incremental change when what we need is a complete overhaul. But we understand that this work is hard and it takes a long time, and we're committed to staying in the fight, and we hope that everyone else is as well.
Well, what's a closing thought? What is it like? I mean, we've all worked on campaigns for issues before on the state level. What is it like campaigning against Amendment 1 during COVID?
Well, it's been incredibly challenging. I mean, for one thing, we, have not had a boots on the ground, door knocking field campaign. We just haven't been able to do that. It's not safe for people. And we certainly weren't going to design a campaign that was going to risk anybody's health, unlike some people running campaigns right now. But so, we've had to be creative about how we're reaching people. We've had to invest a lot more in digital outreach and reaching people on social media. We've had to invest a lot more in phone banking. And we're launching our text bank this week, so that's really exciting. And we've just had to come up with more creative ways to reach voters. And we've also, we've done a pretty good job at building the resource kind of toolkit for people to be, campaigners themselves, to like have their own conversations with people in their family. And we've seen, I get emails every single day from folks that are connected to Lyft that say, want me to know that they had a conversation with their grandmother or, their dad about Amendment 1, and, and convince them to vote against it. And so, this is really a grassroots campaign, and it's by design, but also by necessity because of COVID.
Well, I mean, I applaud y'all for navigating that. I know that I'm not running it for anything this cycle or anytime soon, but when I look at people who are trying to navigate this field right now, the way it's structured, it is so heavily weighted towards people who have unlimited resources to use the digital platforms to get their message out. And really what organizations do with grassroots, which is amazing, is that they always have the ability to get those personal connections, and COVID has really restricted that. So I mean, I appreciate what y'all are trying to do. If nothing else, we're all learning a lot for whenever the next pandemic hits as far as how we're going to deal with it. But I mean, it's so challenging. I really applaud your efforts. I know I've enjoyed working with you over the years. You guys fight the good fight for people who don't know you're fighting for them. I mean, it's amazing to me how until people experience what it's like, until people experience what it's like to be a poor woman with no sex ed, with no resources, who find themselves pregnant with a baby that they don't want, who can't find any mechanism to terminate that pregnancy and have no resources to take care of that baby, until you're in that situation, it's hard for you to say, especially typically in legislature as an old white guy, that I know what's best for you. You don't know what's best for yourself, but I know what's best for you. And I feel like when I talk to people, they always look at everything from their own perspective. Well, I didn't have any babies when I was a kid. Well, your socioeconomic, your educational background gave you advantages to make educated decisions. But I certainly hope as the legislature changes over the next several years, as younger people get in, as newer people get in, that we have some movement on issues that are not really controversial, like sex ed, to the point we can actually have it. Abstinence only education has never worked, because if you don't have sex ed, they don't know why they're abstaining from something
That's
other
right.
than Jesus said so. I mean,
That's right.
that's so. Thank you for all your work. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for all your continued work. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your optimism. Just thank you for everything. And as always, if there's anything that I can do to help, I know that people would love to know how to reach out to Lyft and support Lyft. So if you want to kind of tell people where to go on your website and those sort of things, that would be helpful right now. Because in this day and age, the mission of Lyft is so important, but doing Lyft's mission requires help. And
That's right.
people who are watching this podcast today, I'm sure they want to help.
Well, thanks. And it's always so good to talk to you, JP. And people can go to our website. It's lift, Louisiana.org. And there's a banner on the home page that you can click on to find out everything you need to about Amendment 1 and how to get more involved in the campaign.
Well, thank you so much for being on today, Michelle. It's such an important amendment. This is so much great information for people to know to make an educated decision. I hope it's a correct educated decision, but educated decision on Amendment 1. And as always, thank you everyone out there in TV land for listening, for giving us your time, and for trying to educate yourself on the issues of the day that are so important to your life as well as the lives of your family and loved ones. So thank you, Michelle, for being on Ask JP. I really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you out on the campaign trail for Amendment 1, virtually 6 to 12 feet apart.
Right on.
Thank you.